Thank you very much. Thanks for coming out. Thanks for supporting the library. Holliston Cable's here tonight, and they do a great job, as I'm sure many of you know. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my new book, Wicked Pissed, New England's Most Famous Feuds. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start out, think of it as kind of like a dinner. I'm going to start out with a selection of some appetizer feuds. Think of them as like finger feuds. And we're going to work up to the main course, which is the most delicious dispute you've never heard of. I guarantee. All right. So the first thing I found in researching feuds is that feuds are fascinating. Okay? People love feuds. It's a little bit like, you know, an accident on the highway. You don't really want to rubberneck and look, and you feel a little guilty, but you can't help it, and you do anyway. But feuds are less fascinating. There's one exception, if they're yours. Okay? Feuds become fascinating a lot quicker if it's your feud, much less interesting. And I do point out in the book that feuds were not possible until there was more than one person. Right? So the first chapter is family feuds because that's what it took. And I do start at the beginning, and I do mean the very, very beginning. And don't get me wrong, I mean, terrible thing, Cain and Abel, terrible. However, I have always taken some small degree of comfort in the fact that even the first recorded family in human history had issues, just like every other family. So, big issues, as it turns out. But the biggest family feud in the book, though, is the biggest family feud in New England's history, mostly because it ends up involving over 25,000 people and about $35 million in legal fees and counting. And that, of course, is the feud between the cousins Demoulas. Yeah, but the thing about the Demoulas feud that I love is that there's one seat right over here, ma'am. How would that be? The great thing about the Demoulas feud, it's the only feud in the book that is a twofer feud. It's a twofer because it's not only a family feud, it's also a food fight. So you get a little bit of both. And as long as we're in a literary environment tonight, the other thing that I found when I started researching feuds is that there are a number of feuds that take place in New England that involve like superstars of their respective field, and I had no idea. Anybody know who this is? Kipling. I see, I'm not surprised. We're in a literary environment, and you know that it's Rudyard Kipling. And Rudyard Kipling, of course, born in Mumbai, India, then eventually goes back to London, England. He is the face of Victorian England. Anybody know where Rudyard Kipling spent 3 of his most productive years as a writer? I heard it. Brattleboro, Vermont. How many of you didn't know? I didn't know when I started. And you know what the crazy thing is? Having driven all over and reported all over New England for 20 years, I have driven by Kipling Road in Dummerston, West Brattleboro, Vermont, probably half a dozen times over the years, and always thought, I wonder if there's a connection. There is. It's where he lived. And that's exactly where he lived. This was Kipling's dream house, built in the hills of West Brattleboro, Vermont, that he called Nolaka, which is a Hindi word meaning gem of gems. And that's where Rudyard Kipling really expected to live out the rest of his life. When he moved there as a relatively young man, as a newlywed, he looked out on Mount Monadnock to the east, and this was his dream house. He spent 3 of his most productive years as a writer. That's Kipling in his study in Nolaka. It's where he wrote arguably his most famous work, The Jungle Book. Unfortunately for Rudyard Kipling, he had a terrible falling out with his brother-in-law. And if you have a falling out with a family member and you live in Holliston, and that family member lives in, say, Wichita, you know, it may cause you some degree of angst, but you're probably not going to be at it with each other every day. Unfortunately for Rudyard Kipling, his brother-in-law lived literally next door. So there was no getting around it. It drove him from Vermont never to return. However, the good news is that Nolaka is still there on Kipling Road. And you can rent it, and you can stay there. And you can sit at Kipling's desk in his writing chair, as I did. I sat there for about an hour and a half. I think they were going to charge me for the week. But I'm going to jump past this to talk about, I joke about the book starting with, you know, the first family feud. I actually start the book with America's founding feud because, of course, America is founded in a feud, the American Revolution. You don't get a bigger feud than an actual shooting war with a body count. That's a major feud, right? And you know, it starts, of course, with, this is the Minuteman statue on Lexington Green, where on April 19, 1775, the early morning hours, the shot heard round the world is fired. And then the British march on to the Old North Bridge in Concord, where they are met by a larger force of rebels, as they would have said, and their day goes downhill very quickly. Now, if you think about America's closest strategic ally and most longtime friend in the world, you think immediately of England, Great Britain, right? Ironically. You know who is still fighting and relitigating and rehashing the American Revolution? Concord and Lexington. To this day. This is the poster to an exhibit that just finished less than a year ago at Buckman Tavern in Lexington, detailing how for 250 years Concord and Lexington are still sniping at each other, which the British find very, very ironic indeed. But when I was researching Concord and Lexington, I came across another feud, which is a little different because I sort of knew that it existed. What I didn't know was just how potent it still is today and the new forms it has taken in the modern era. How many of you grew up in New England? How many of you are from New England? So most of you. So you know, in a way that, say, those in Wichita wouldn't, that the Battle of Bunker Hill was fought not on Bunker Hill, but on, thank you, Breed's Hill, where on June 17, 1775, although the Americans are driven off of the hill, nonetheless, the British begin to lose the war. Now, as you know that it was fought on Breed's Hill. Now, many prominent historians consider the misnaming of the Battle of Bunker Hill one of the greatest historical inaccuracies in American history. And no less a great historian and writer, by the way. Nathaniel Philbrick, anybody read anything by Nathaniel Philbrick? Wonderful writer, right? Written most recently about the Mayflower and the Pilgrim's First Winter. About 10 years ago, wrote a definitive book about the Battle of Bunker Hill, in which he calls the misnaming of the Battle of Bunker Hill the most egregious historical inaccuracy in America's history. And he called his book Bunker Hill. I think he lost a very teachable moment. So, nonetheless, for the better part of almost 300 years now, the bunkers, 13 generations and counting now, even though they don't deserve it, even though they didn't earn it, even though it is not true, they get the monument, and they get the guided missile frigate, and they get the community college, and they get the cities and towns across America named after them. They even get a drag strip in Indiana. What's even more absurd is they get a chili sauce. That hurts. And you know what the Breeds get? A plaque. And this is not even actual size. They get a plaque. And it really bothers now 13 generations and counting of Breeds, like Jed Breed from Cambridge, an entrepreneur, and here I am talking with him at the steps of Bunker Hill a couple of years ago, and he tells me and has told me that he feels honor-bound wherever he is. If he hears somebody talking about the Battle of Bunker Hill, he feels that he has to defend the honor of his family and correct them. I've told him that he's lucky he still has all his front teeth. But there's only one sports feud that I include in the book, even though there are several to choose from in New England. But it's the only one that needs no introduction. If you say the rivalry, people know you're talking about Red Sox-Yankees. And of course, it starts with the most famous Red Sox of all time, who becomes the most famous Yankee of all time. And it continues through the decades with Williams and DiMaggio, and in the 70s with Fisk and Munson. And it leads, of course, to the creation of the Munson-Nixon line, which is a real thing. It's a real thing. And that is the putative boundary between Red Sox Nation to the north and the evil empire to the south. And it runs through Hartford, Connecticut, which is perfect because that's where we're going to jump off and dig in to our featured feud. So, anybody from Connecticut here? Anybody from Connecticut? So, if you see this photograph, which has been called the most reproduced photograph in human history, you think what? Wright brothers. First flight, right? Early morning hours of December 17th, 1903, Orville Wright at the controls of the Wright Flyer lifts off a sand dune at Kill Devil Hills, Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, lifts into the air for 12 seconds or so, his brother Wilbur running alongside, and the era of aviation and the riddle of flight has finally been solved, right? And they become justly famous. These are the Wright brothers on the steps of their house in Dayton, Ohio. 6 years later, they have been the toast of the world now and celebrated as the pioneers and the inventors of the airplane. All of which is true, but there may be, increasingly, it seems, the possibility of an asterisk going alongside the Wright brothers, because there is a growing body of evidence that this crazy-looking thing lifted into the air a full 2 years before the Wright brothers, and that this man was at the controls. Ever hear of Gustav Whitehead? You're about to. You'll hear more about him in the coming year or so. There'll be a documentary film coming out. Gustav Whitehead, born Gustav Weisskopf, was born in Leutershausen, Germany, Bavaria. Even as a child, he was known as the Bird. Now, being obsessed with flying as he was in the latter years of the 1800s did not mean being obsessed with airplanes, because, of course, airplanes did not yet exist. But it did mean being obsessed with creating ever more complicated gliders, balloons, kites that were big enough and strong enough to lift a person off the ground. He emigrated to the United States. His first job in America, not far from here, Milton, Massachusetts. He got a job designing weather balloons at the Blue Hill Weather Observatory. By 1901, he had moved to Bridgeport, Connecticut, and he was at work on his 21st flying machine. Number 20 was destroyed when it flew into the third story of a building off a park in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The third story. It wasn't lifted up there. So he is now at work in 1901 with a crew of guys who are tweaking and sort of perfecting number 21. His number 21, the 21st machine, flying machine that he was at work on. Now, if you're like me, you might be wondering right now, because when I first found out about Gustav Whitehead, it was the first thing I wondered was, A, how come I've never heard of him? And B, how come I've never seen these photographs, if they exist? So, two things I can tell you right off, which I've learned in the process of researching Gustav Whitehead, and I think they go to that question of why we don't know more about him and why you haven't seen photographs like this. So number one, history records, when it comes to achievements, inventions, landmark achievements, history records, almost without exception, history records the winners. It doesn't record the losers. Quick. Who came very close to inventing the telephone before Alexander Graham Bell? Exactly. So there were many people, and this is the second part, there were many people who were racing to achieve first flight. There were many people. The Wright brothers were not alone. And I think when we learn about first flight and the Wright brothers and how flight happened, we think of it as the story of these two somewhat peculiar brothers who were single-mindedly determined to create the airplane, and they spent the better part of a decade single-mindedly going back and forth from Dayton, Ohio to Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, trying and trying again until one day, December 17th, 1903, finally, miraculously, it happened. I call it the myth of immaculate aviation. It happened to a point, but the part that we don't learn is that they weren't alone. There were other people who had the same single-minded determination, who were just as obsessed, and were trying to make this happen at the same time. But their names are lost to history. Canute, Langley, Lilienthal. Langley might sound familiar because he had an Air Force base named after him. And Whitehead. So contemporaries of these guys, they knew about them, just like they knew about Whitehead. Right? Contemporary, they knew about him. He was being written about. American inventor, 1901, cover. The popular mechanics of its time. Huge distribution for its time. Gustav Whitehead was on the cover. So if you said, who's Gustav Whitehead, to folks in 1901, they knew about him. So he's racing just like the Wright brothers. The Wright brothers knew about Whitehead. Whitehead knew about Orville and Wilbur Wright. The problem for first flight, the biggest hurdle, was how you would power something to fly. Because the four elements to achieve first flight were you had to have control, it had to be sustained, it had to be manned, and these were all at this point men, and it had to be powered. So the fuel source was the biggest hurdle because it had to be light and it had to be powerful enough. Now, people have tried everything. Sam Langley, who I mentioned a moment ago, he tried steam. Water's very heavy. Was never going to work, and it didn't. But Whitehead settled on a fuel source that nobody else had tried, acetylene. The chemical acetylene. Extremely light, extremely flammable, burns with an intense heat and power for a very short period of time, perfect for a short flight. And Whitehead also had an advantage that the Wright brothers didn't have. Because the Wright brothers, while they were terrifically talented bicycle makers, that's what they did. They made bicycles, and that helped them craft a wonderfully intricate and yet lightweight frame for the Wright Flyer. They knew nothing about making an engine. So they had to outsource making an engine. Gustav Whitehead was an engine builder, one of his talents. So he made his own engine using acetylene. And one more thing. Although you can't see it, there are wheels under there. The Wright brothers used gravity to get into the air. They ran a track down a steep sand dune at Kitty Hawk. Later on, they even used a catapult to get into the air. Whitehead will taxi and achieve liftoff just like a 747 does today. So by August 1901, Gustav Whitehead and his crew are ready to test number 21. They spent about a week rolling out a section of dirt road just over the Bridgeport line in Fairfield to act as a crude kind of runway. They use an ox cart and they pull number 21 out early one morning. It's hot, it's humid, and it's dark. That's a key. It's pre-dawn. Sun is not up. That's by design. They power up, they fuel up, they power up, they remove a couple of boulders that are acting as crude chocks in front of the wheels, and Whitehead is airborne. He flies over a short stretch of Long Island Sound between Fairfield and Bridgeport. This is an artist's rendering of what number 21 might have looked like in flight. It was said to be beautiful, like a bird. And he landed about half an hour later, just as the sun was rising in Bridgeport, Connecticut. So the question is, did he do it? Well, I can tell you, if he did it, these are how the numbers would stack up. The Wright brothers flew for about 12 seconds, about 120 feet, at a height of about a very tall NBA center today. Whitehead flew for almost half a mile, just under half an hour, at 50 feet in the air, or the height of a lot of buildings in Bridgeport, Connecticut. So again, why don't we have that same iconic photograph of number 21 in flight? He didn't take a picture. This is a sharp crowd. He didn't take a picture. So the bigger question is, why didn't he take a picture? It wasn't that it didn't occur to him. The Wright brothers had 3 photographers standing by when they took off in Kitty Hawk. Interestingly, only one of them got a picture, but it's the one that we remember. So why didn't Whitehead want a picture? So the key is, I think, what he has in his hands. His engine is on the ground in front of him, and he's holding his just about year-old daughter, his first child, Rose. He's just started to have a family of his own. So Gustav Whitehead was a German immigrant. Spoke very little English at a time of rising, sometimes virulent, anti-German sentiment worldwide. In less than 10 years, World War I will break out with Germany in Europe. He also had what we would call today uncertain immigration status. And there was no wall to keep him out. So, it's my only editorial comment of the night. So, the only thing that scared Gustav Whitehead more than missing out on the honor of achieving first flight was losing his family. And he was convinced that if he drew too much attention to himself as a German who spoke little English, who may or may not have had the proper papers to be here, he thought he might imperil his family and that he might be deported. So he made the decision not to attract too much attention, like having photographs taken. It turned out to be a most fateful decision. He never flew again. He did turn to doing what he could do best to support his family, which was building engine components. Don't forget, within 6 years, 10 years of his flight, commercial aviation became a very successful enterprise, and Gustav Whitehead was designing engine components for aviation companies like Curtiss Aviation. He did design the prototype for a helicopter, and he died in 1927 in Bridgeport, Connecticut, largely unknown, mostly penniless. And if that's all that was ever known about Gustav Whitehead, that might have been something that only the most intrepid researcher who went to Bridgeport, Connecticut might ever find out. But this is where the Whitehead story takes a turn over the next 10 decades, which is really remarkable, which makes it extraordinary, because at regular intervals, somebody will come along who not only becomes fascinated by the Whitehead story, but who has a certain skill set that allows this person to advance the Whitehead story up to the present day, right now, the present day. And the first person to come along is an extraordinary woman named Stella Randolph. She's light years ahead of her time. In the 1930s, she's a lawyer, she's a journalist, she's a teacher. She grows up hearing about the Whitehead story from her dad, and she realizes around 1940 that there is an element of the Whitehead story that has never been dealt with. And if somebody doesn't do it now, she realizes, the opportunity will be lost forever. Because even though there were no photographs of Whitehead in flight, there were almost 30 eyewitnesses to his flight that day. But none of them have ever been deposed. In other words, none of them have ever given sworn legal testimony to what they saw and heard that morning in August 1901. And she puts her lawyer hat and her journalist hat on. She goes to Bridgeport, Connecticut for several months, and she takes legal testimony of these eyewitnesses. And these become the basis of the first two books written about Gustav Whitehead, both written by Stella Randolph. And now, for the first time in the early 1940s, the Whitehead story goes beyond Connecticut for the first time. And in these early years of the 1940s, Connecticut begins fielding queries for the first time from people outside of Connecticut. Researchers, historians, aviation researchers, people in Germany who want to know, what do you got, Connecticut? What are you sitting on up there? What do you got about this guy? Well, Connecticut doesn't have the skill or the wherewithal to really be able to comment credibly on whether or not this flight really happened. What they want is someone who has that kind of credibility, that kind of expertise to come in and conduct an investigation. And they turn to the one body in America that they know has that kind of expertise to come in and conduct an aviation investigation. They turn to the Smithsonian Institution. And the Smithsonian in the early 1940s says no. It's the same answer they will give Connecticut for almost the next 75, 80, 100 years. No. So Connecticut wonders, well, why? What's the problem? They begin to surmise by the late 1940s it has to do with history's most famous airplane. Not number 21, the Wright Flyer. You're looking at the Wright Flyer on the day that it was unveiled to the public in Washington, D.C., having been given to the Smithsonian by the heirs of Wilbur and Orville Wright, the Wright family. They donated and gave the Wright Flyer to the Smithsonian. Now, at this time, Stella Randolph is at work with the next person who comes along, Bill O'Dwyer. Bill O'Dwyer is a decorated, retired Air Force major who becomes fascinated with the Whitehead story from a standpoint of aeronautics. In other words, could number 21 have actually flown? Because his feeling always was, if we could prove if number 21 was airworthy, there's room to continue the investigation. If we could conclude that this is crazy, it never could have flown, there's no point in continuing the investigation. So he was at work with Stella Randolph in the middle, in her 80s now. They are actually in this picture in Leutershausen, Germany at the Whitehead Museum. They were at work on a book about Gustav Whitehead when Bill O'Dwyer is talking with a friend of his. He had a friend in high places in Connecticut. This is Lowell Weicker, former Connecticut Republican, Connecticut former senator, former governor, former attorney general. Lowell Weicker does not like to be told no. He didn't like being told no by Richard Nixon's representatives when he was a member of the Watergate Committee. And he hasn't enjoyed being told no for all these many years when Connecticut has officially asked the Smithsonian to investigate the Whitehead claim. And by the late 1960s, early 1970s, Weicker has begun hearing rumors about the agreement that the Smithsonian entered into when they took possession of the Wright Flyer. Now, much of it was boilerplate, had to do with things like maintenance of the plane and security around the plane and the duration of the gift and that sort of thing. But Whitehead hears rumors repeatedly about a clause that might or might not be in this agreement that strikes people as very peculiar. And the clause basically stipulates, supposedly, that in taking possession of the Wright Flyer, the Smithsonian may never acknowledge that anyone but the Wright brothers were first in flight. And if they do, the Wright family can take back the plane. It becomes known as the secret agreement, and Lowell Weicker becomes the first major public figure to take advantage of a relatively new piece of legislation called the Freedom of Information Act. And he pries the agreement loose and makes it public. And sure enough, that peculiar clause is right there in black and white. So the Smithsonian is now forced to comment on this. Bill O'Dwyer and Stella Randolph, at the same time, pivot and write a different book called History by Contract, in which they lay out this agreement. And they use the agreement, the secret agreement, as a premise for why the Smithsonian may have all these years refused to investigate the Whitehead story. At this point, the Smithsonian, for its part, has opened up its famous Air and Space Museum, and the Wright Flyer is the centerpiece of the Air and Space Museum. Perhaps you've seen it there. And they are forced to comment on this secret agreement. And they do. They say it was not a secret. Not a secret. The only problem is nobody asked us about it. We would have been happy to talk about this not so secret agreement. But no one asked. You got to ask us, folks. We don't know what's on your mind. And the person who comments is Tom Crouch. Tom Crouch is the aviation curator emeritus of the Air and Space Museum. I interviewed Tom in the process of writing my book. He's a brilliant guy, knows everything there is to know about the history of American aviation. Connecticut has a problem with Tom Crouch, for starters, in that he, like the Wright brothers, is a native of Dayton, Ohio. Now, I don't think that should be disqualifying, personally. I don't. It's not your fault where you're born. You don't pick where you're born. You don't pick your parents, right? They have a bigger problem, and I would say a better argument, with the fact that Tom Crouch is also the first official biographer of the Wright brothers. But nonetheless, by this point in the late, in the 1980s, the answer to Connecticut, every time, like clockwork, every decade, that every new governor becomes a sort of a rite of passage for each new governor. And Governor Grasso, by the 1980s, has requested again for the Smithsonian to please conduct an investigation, and again, they say no. And it falls to the third of the 4 people who come along to advance the Whitehead story by 1980s. His name's Andy Koch. He's a world-class adventurer. He has summited mountain peaks around the world. He's scuba dived, parachuted all over the world. Really, at his heart, is a wonderful teacher. Still teaching today, full-time, in his late 70s in Fairfield, Connecticut. He is also a master craftsman. And he goes to a lecture in the early 1980s given by Bill O'Dwyer in Stamford, Connecticut. And he knows that Bill O'Dwyer, as a pilot, is interested in the Whitehead saga from a standpoint of aeronautics. And Andy Koch is a very logical, common sense kind of guy who loves to build things. And so he goes up to Bill O'Dwyer at the end of the talk and he says, "Major, what if we could fly number 21 again?" And O'Dwyer looked around for the guys in the white coats and he said, "How do you propose to do that?" And he said, "Well, what if we built an authentic replica to get a sense of what you've been after all these years, whether or not it was airworthy?" And O'Dwyer says, "Well, who's going to build that?" And Andy Koch says, "I am." And he does. He first builds a 3/8 replica, and he decides that he will impanel a group of aviation experts and engineers and historians. And unless they feel that he is on the right path, he won't build a full-size replica. But they feel that he is very much on the right path. And he does build a full-size replica. There is nothing on his replica that was not available in 1901. And I interviewed Andy Koch in the process of writing my book. And, you know, I said to him, and this is interesting, about how authentic this replica was. I said, "You know, Andy, everything I've read about your flight, there's no question that you made an incredibly, painstakingly authentic replica. But I said, nonetheless, as you know, there are things, intangibles, that are simply unknown. Nobody knows, for instance, what the wind conditions were when Whitehead made his flight." I said, you know how important that is in terms of tailwinds, in terms of crosswinds. We just don't know. He said, "Let me tell you this." He said, "Whitehead, when he was all done, fully fueled up, number 21 weighed about 213 pounds. He said, when we finish, fully fueled up with a tank full of acetylene, we came in at 209 pounds. So we added a 75-pound sandbag so that nobody could accuse us of cutting corners or making it easy on ourselves." He said, "The other thing I can tell you is that when we had powered up and we removed the chocks and I was on the runway — by the way, the runway in Bridgeport, Sikorsky Airport, they laid out dirt over it so that it would approximate a dirt road and not a tarmac. And he said, we powered up, I began to roll, I turned to adjust the tiller. This had a tiller because, by the way, unlike the Wright brothers, the Wright Flyer was not very controllable. Gustav Whitehead designed a complex system with a tiller and that mast. And what he had with a series of over 135 guy wires was what airplanes use today, ailerons. He was able to control up, down, sideways, side to side. Andy Koch said that as he went to adjust the tiller, his watch fell off. The watch had an altimeter. The altimeter was key to knowing whether or not they achieved the 50 feet that we know Whitehead achieved. So he said, I started looking around for my watch. And then he said, it occurred to me that the only thing worse than not having the watch would be if the plane went onto the grass infield and cracked up. So he said, I immediately brought myself to my upright position, and I was already 35 feet off the ground. Had no idea. He said all that thing wanted to do was get into the air, and it did. So they rolled it out, and Andy Koch took off. Whitehead flew for just under half an hour. With the same amount of acetylene, Andy Koch realized that after half an hour, he was still flying, and he decided he would go for as long as he could. He flew for almost an hour. He landed back in Bridgeport. He got a hero's welcome. And now the Whitehead story goes national in a way that it never has before. 60 Minutes in 1987 did its first story, Were the Rights Wrong? And along comes the fourth and final person who takes us up to the present day in terms of advancing the Whitehead story. His name's John Brown. Grew up never hearing, never knowing anything about Gustav Whitehead. In fact, as far as I know, he may never have heard of Connecticut. But he had a very good reason. John Brown grew up in Melbourne, Australia. He is an aviation curator. He's an aviation historian. He is also a detective. And he, in a stunning turn of irony, in 2000, is hired to produce a series of television specials in the United States on the history of American aviation. He's hired by the Smithsonian, specifically Tom Crouch, who will regret this hire and this decision all his life. In the process of learning about the history of American aviation, John Brown comes across the little footnote of Gustav Whitehead, and he files it away. He has a photographic memory, by the way. And in 2000, he comes over to Washington, and he meets for the first time with Tom Crouch, and they talk about how they're going to produce these specials. And when the meeting is over and they're getting up, before he heads back to his hotel, he turns to Tom Crouch, and he says, Tom, one other question. What do you know about Gustav Whitehead? And Crouch says, you know he didn't fly, right? So, to John Brown's detective ear, he's just heard what a detective calls a tell. A tell. Someone has been asked something, but rather than answer the question, they immediately go to a different agenda. And this struck John Brown not only as very curious, but very much what he was expecting, based on what he'd already learned. So he decides he's going to take advantage of the fact that he's over here in the States and immediately do some investigating on Gustav Whitehead. He goes first to Bridgeport, Connecticut, where it only takes him 48 hours to uncover something that Connecticut has been told has been lost for 100 years. He finds a contemporaneous newspaper account of Gustav Whitehead's flight. Next day, Bridgeport Herald, talking about a local boy who flew over Long Island Sound. Then he goes immediately over to Leutershausen, Germany, where he spends 3.5 weeks at the Whitehead Museum. And he finds this photograph in the attic. And it's significant because he was looking at this photograph that you are. But his eye went to this photograph. Photograph within the photograph. So this photograph in red is something that the folks at the Aero Club of America exhibition in 1906 were looking at. Something about that photograph intrigued him. He asked for a magnifying glass, and then it intrigued him more. He asked if there was any way they could blow up this photograph, and they said they couldn't, but we could go to the local police station, which they did. The local police station said, we can only enlarge it 2 or 3 times. He said, that won't do. But they said, well, how about this? We'll drive you to the local equivalent of the German FBI, and maybe they can blow it up more. And they did, and they blew it up about 300 times. And then John Brown was looking at this, which doesn't look like much, perhaps, to the average person, but John Brown has a photographic memory. And in looking at that photograph, he was immediately put in mind of Stella Randolph's second book, and Eyewitness Testimony number 29. Because Eyewitness Testimony number 29 was of a bank teller in Bridgeport, Connecticut, whose job it was to open the bank the morning that Whitehead made his flight. And he was opening the bank about 5:35 a.m. Gustav Whitehead landed back in Bridgeport as the sun was coming up at 5:36, opposite the bank. Now, the bank teller didn't take a picture, but the bank teller said that as he was opening the bank door, he dropped his keys because he heard what sounded like a lawnmower over his head, which is exactly what this crude 2-stroke engine would have sounded like. And he said, when I looked up, I didn't see anything, but I saw on the building right across the street what looked like a box camera on a tripod. If the shutter was clicked from that box camera, they may have taken the only known photograph of number 21 as it landed on a vacant lot on Pine Street right opposite the bank. The Smithsonian calls this photograph the smudge. So now John Brown has what he feels is a growing amount of circumstantial evidence to support at least the strong possibility that Gustav Whitehead had flown 2 years before the Wright brothers. And in 2013, he wants to share it, his evidence, with what's called the Bible of Aviation, Jane's All the World's Aircraft. In 2013, they were at the editors of Jane's were at an air show in Frankfurt, Germany in March 2013. And John Brown, who was by that point living in Munich, asked if he could meet with them. And they gave him 30 minutes. 90 minutes later, the meeting broke up. 2 months later, the centennial edition, the 2013 centennial edition of Jane's came out. And inside the centennial edition was an announcement from the editorial staff of Jane's, in which they said, it is now the opinion of the editors of Jane's that in 1901, first flight was achieved by a German immigrant named Gustav Whitehead in Bridgeport, Connecticut, 2 years before the Wright brothers. That is all Connecticut had to hear. For 100 years, basically, they have heard nothing but basically get lost from North Carolina, Ohio, the Smithsonian, and in June 2013, the Connecticut State Assembly, without a single dissenting vote, try doing that with another piece of legislation today, passed a bill, still on the books now, 3 years later, which makes Connecticut the only state in America which officially, by act of the state legislature, recognizes someone other than the Wright brothers as first in flight. So you might be wondering, as we wrap up, does this change history? You might think I was leading up to a different conclusion, but I don't think it does. It doesn't. Gustav Whitehead made a fateful decision. He made the decision not to have conclusive proof of his flight, which only could have been done with a photograph. Now, he might have done it for the noblest of reasons, but he made that decision nonetheless, and it had serious consequences over the years. So I don't think it can be said definitively that Gustav Whitehead flew before the Wright brothers. If you ask me, however, is there a very strong possibility that someone flew before the Wright brothers? Absolutely. And I think if there is, it's this man. Now, if you go to Kitty Hawk today, and maybe some of you have, beautiful, beautiful National Park monument, soaring monument to the Wright brothers. If you go to Bridgeport, not quite so much. All I can tell you is if you want to see the monument to Gustav Whitehead in Bridgeport and you reach this intersection, pray for a red light. It goes by very quickly. It took them a full year just to appropriate the funding to inscribe the marble at the base. But as I say in the book, when I wrap up the chapter on Whitehead, nonetheless, in Bridgeport, Connecticut, for 100 years, successive generations have grown up, and in Bridgeport, Connecticut, unlike any other place in America, they have learned for 100 years that a poor German immigrant on a hot August morning in 1901 rose into the air and beat the Wright brothers by 2 years. On this, however, everybody in Connecticut will agree who knows this story, and that is that at the very least, North Carolina should tweak its license plate. And that is the story of Whitehead. Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. My favorite food one, I always want to say feud when I say food, but that's why I asked if anybody's from Connecticut here, because in New Haven, Connecticut, is my favorite New England food feud, and it has to do with pizza. Anybody ever tasted Sally's or Pepe's Pizza? Yeah?
Well, they have one in Chestnut Hill.
Well, they have one in Chestnut Hill. which goes to the fact that Pepe's, unlike Sally's, a friend of mine, my good friend Chris Russell, who grew up in Connecticut, he calls Pepe's the Yankees of the feud, because they're more the corporate pinstriped, and they have franchised, right? And so they have other satellite Pepe's now. But it starts with Frank Pepe right here in New Haven, Connecticut, who opens up his pizzeria in the early 1930s on Worcester Street, the Italian section of New Haven, and he cooks and bakes his authentic Neapolitan pizza, which he grew up learning to make in Naples, Italy. And he has a nephew, Sal Consiglio, who learns with his Uncle Frank how to make this authentic Neapolitan pizza. And then when Sal is in his 20s, he decides, just like his Uncle Frank did, to go off and open his own pizzeria. The thing about Sally Consiglio is Sally has the opposite of wanderlust. Doesn't want to go too far. Doesn't want to step outside his comfort zone in terms of geography. So he opens his pizzeria right down the street from his Uncle Frank, thus leading to 75 years of this delicious feud of Sally's and Pepe's Pizza. So I always say, if anybody is from, if I have people from Connecticut, I always ask them if they're a Sally's or a Pepe's person. I personally am a Sally's person, but it's just a question of taste. Thank you very much. Thanks, folks.